Hey there, welcome to the Kingdom Calibrate podcast, where we host honest conversations about theology, leadership, and practices for Christ followers. So be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcast content, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Buzzsprout, all the good places. You can also watch live on YouTube and just follow us every single day, man, because we really would love to be able to share some information with you. And I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have today. So today is called episode 105, a fresh take on discipleship. And to be talking about this, I've invited a very special friend and colleague, a guy who gets to work with me at least a few times a week, named Tony. So Tony, welcome to the podcast, man.
Thank you so much for having me on, Dusty. I'm so excited about what God is doing through Kingdom Calibrate, and just, man, I'm blessed to work with you. And we go to lunch together, which is like the highlight of my week.
We do. Now, when you say you're blessed to work with me, do you mean like I'm blessed, like in an all bless your heart church kind of way?
It just depends on the day.
Okay, that's accurate. I'd love to talk about that some other time, of like how to create a staff team full of diverse personalities and ideas, and everybody still gets along at the end of the day, which would be my favorite thing in the world to talk about. Because like the one thing I love about working with you is we get to come from two different angles, and we kind of get to oversee two different sides of the church that, you know, I think at times can compete with one another, right? I kind of oversee the gatherings, you oversee the deep spiritual formation pieces, and sometimes those compete, but in a perfect world, those work together. And that's a conversation for a whole other day that would probably be a separate podcast. That
I mean, listen, now what I'll say most is I deeply appreciate the fact that that we have a team full of people that just think so differently about some of the things, about what's important and what's not important, and like how do we live in the tension. One of my favorite sayings, it's not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be managed.
Yes, that's gold for churches right there. Everything is a tension to be managed, not a problem to be solved. That's fantastic. So, man, real quick, just kind of give people a rundown. You obviously have your own podcast, so I'm kind of bringing you onto mine, which is a whole different world, right? Being in the other seat.
Yeah, it's always a little awkward being on this side of the microphone and not asking questions and taking all the copious notes and all the things. But yeah, so it's it really is an honor to be here.
I mean, you can ask any question you want, to be fair.
Trust me, I'm going to.
I mean, I already almost flubbed up the whole intro, so it's fine. We got through it together. Well, hey, man, let me ask you this, just to give people a little bit of an update on who you are and where you come from. What is it that led you to where you are today in your ministry, in your life, in your work?
Well, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version since we don't have 6 hours to go through it all. But essentially, I grew up Catholic, born and raised in the Catholic Church, loved Catholicism, enlisted in the Army Reserves in 1998. And man, God has just put a calling on my life to foster deep relationships, right? And that's kind of was born out of that time in the Army. I spent 14 years in the reserves as a chaplain's assistant, got to do ministry all over the world, some really, exotic locations, El Salvador, Kuwait, Iraq, Minnesota, like some just far out there places. And I hope you like that Minnesota joke.
I like that Minnesota made the list. I wasn't sure if it was a joke, but now I'm confident it was. I can laugh.
And yeah, I mean, God just really showed me some things about what it means to follow him from a really big picture, both theologically and meeting people where they are. And so in 2011, through a lot of twists and turns, I ended up finding myself at a Methodist church, and left Catholicism for Methodism and began working as the director of adult education, which eventually led to the life group's pastor, and then finished my master's in divinity and became a lead pastor here in Centerville. And then poof, 7 years after leading a church there, I took some time off, and then now I serve on the team with you and so many of our other incredible colleagues as the associate pastor of disciple making at Centerville Grace. In addition to the podcast stuff that I do, and also kind of doing my own coaching, strategic planning for nonprofits and that sort of thing.
Awesome, man. How is it? This is an unscripted question. How is it going from a lead pastor role into, working just as kind of somebody on the team? How's that shift been for you?
95% of the time, it's amazing, right? Because you get to do all the fun stuff and don't have to deal with any of the bad stuff. And 5% of the time, it's incredibly frustrating because I have opinions about how I think things should be handled. And now the guy that we work with, Pastor Dave, he's an incredible leader. And so I'm very thankful for his leadership. And honestly, I wouldn't have said yes to being on anyone else's team. It really does require a certain level of leadership to handle my ego, if I can just be really honest about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that honesty. I mean, I think we've all got a little healthy ego about us, and it's always a thin line between confidence and ego when it comes to things, especially when you have experience, right?
Right. Sure. Yeah. And I, more than anything, Dave's heart for the Lord is always reassuring, and the team that we've put together, their faith makes mine stronger. So, yeah, I'm thankful.
Yeah, well, that's awesome, man. Well, yeah, it's always fun to work with you, and obviously, we both work for a very awesome pastor who will be on here at some point too. He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to get on one of these soon enough. Once I have the
submit
courage
some
to ask him.
questions.
Perfect. Well, awesome, man. Well, hey, so you kind of your role at the church is what? It's your actual role, so I don't mess it up.
Associate pastor of disciple making.
Okay. And you've got a really great perspective. And I think it's actually a pretty fresh perspective on disciple making and what that looks like in the modern church. So just for the sake of the conversation, I always kind of put it in these three categories, which is like, discipleship, discipling, disciple making. But just for the purpose of today, to keep it simple, I'm going to wrap that all in the term of umbrella of discipleship. So what does discipleship look like to you if you could describe it?
Yeah, so I would say that discipleship or disciple making is when we walk alongside someone in their journey of faith. We root them in scripture, and then it must be multiplied. And so, said another way, it's intentional, relational, reproducible, and sacrificial, right? And so, and in doing so, it becomes missional. I love Robert Coleman's book, Master Plan of Evangelism. And it talks about how this idea of this relational, intentional, reproducible process that's spread out. And I think, honestly, I think we get it from Jesus. And it's one of those things that's not programmed or a ministry of the church, but rather it's an identity of the Christian.
Yeah, that's good. And did Robert Coleman, he had another book, right? He did a couple of them. Because I think I have one from him that was called The Master Plan of Discipleship, I think.
So he was pressured. Yeah. So the thing is that because he called it Master Plan of Evangelism, no one thought it was a discipleship book.
Got it.
So he kind of wrote a follow-up to it after it became a bestseller multiple times over. You know how this works, right? The publisher's like, write another one and we'll just use the same format, right? And so, but Coleman's basic theory in the book was the same thing that Jesus kind of did, which is just like, hey, I'm going to find people who are connected to me relationally, or I'm going to find some people who are connected to me just in the world or could be connected to me. And then I'm going to invite them to walk with me, and I'm going to teach them how to teach people to follow Jesus. And that's probably the biggest difference, right? And what we see in the majority of the programmatic church that we see today, like for a long time, if you grew up Baptist, the bus ministry was also underneath discipleship. But really, that was just logistics. And so when we get really specific about what we're trying to do with discipleship, everything begins to shift and change and become more clear.
Okay, well, that's a perfect segue because I'd love for you to talk a little bit about where has the church succeeded. And we talk about the church, let's just say, maybe the church building, not the capital C church across the world, but in our church programs and our weekly gathering services, where has the church succeeded and where has it maybe missed the mark on what that looks like?
So this is what I'll say, right, is that the church has succeeded in using the word discipleship in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
And this is a backhanded compliment. I just realized it as it was coming out of my mouth. But we're here now. So listen, I love the church. I love the local church. Where I'll tell you that I struggle is that the North American church model has really pushed people to teach them how to come to church and not how to follow Jesus. And so the consumerism kind of mindset that we share and we do and we lift up in the North American model is so counterintuitive to what Jesus did. Now, what I will say is that the preaching has gotten better, the access to information has gotten better. So there's some theological pieces that's important for discipleship, but and that's become really easy to get a hold of. Whereas the intentional, relational, reproducible, missional part of disciple making is much harder. And that's the part that I think the church has really dropped the ball, is that when everything becomes discipleship or disciple making, then nothing is essentially discipleship or disciple making.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I got to think about that for a second. So I think you're right. Well, let me ask this next question, because this goes right with it, and then I'm going to come back on some things, because these are statements that probably require a little bit of digging into, especially for church leaders that are listening to this.
Sure.
So let's break it down this way. What's the role of the weekend experience in relation to discipleship, and what should we be doing on our own? And maybe a third part in there is, what can the programmed church support that will allow us to do it better on our own, so we can, like you said, follow Jesus more closely?
So this is what I would say, right? The weekend experience is a spiritual discipline that every Christian should have, right? We should worship as a collective part of our identity, right? So Sunday morning and the worship experience is really important to who we are as Christians. And it's a tool in disciple making, right? It's a tool in discipleship. Now, I know we were going to try to put everything under the umbrella, but if I were going to quickly just delineate the two a little bit, because that's who I am, discipleship is teaching someone about Jesus, like it's theological framework, it's teaching, it's education, it's those kind of things. Disciple making is teaching someone how to teach someone to follow Jesus. And so the difference is super important in the sense of, like, in disciple making, I'm walking with you and I'm teaching you how to teach someone to follow Jesus as I'm teaching you to follow Jesus. So, at the risk of sounding like the Matrix, right? When I come to church with someone that I'm discipling, then what I'm doing is I'm letting them experience the theological learnings, which is discipleship. That's the big umbrella. And then afterwards, I'm pulling them aside, just like we saw Jesus do with the disciples. And I'm telling them, okay, what do we learn from this? Why is this important? How would you do this with someone that you're discipling? And so it's that next level of kind of drilling down on the idea that the weekend experience is a tool. And actually, I think most of what we experience in the North American church, the programmed parts, are all great tools for disciple making. And they're really important to the extent that we have relationships that are intentional and reproducible. And so if you can come to anything that the church does and not have to be relational about it, then I would question whether or not it's super fruitful long-term. And that's not to say that some of those things aren't important and they're not part of spiritual disciplines and helping our relationship with the Lord. But from a program perspective, like, I want something that I can give to someone that they can give to someone else as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it strikes me like as those words that, Paul kind of said, for lack of better language, like, hey, follow me as I follow Christ, right? So everything that we're trying to do as we bring people along that journey is, we can partner with people, but it's like, I'm trying to follow Christ. I want you to watch me follow Christ. That way you can follow Christ more. And then when I think of the weekend, gathered, produced church, I don't really have a great word for it, because like you said, in the North American or Western model, it's kind of got its own thing going at this point. So I don't have great verbiage for it, but in what most of us would consider church that grew up, in the United States, man, I don't know. Like, it's everything we do should be a catalyst, right, for helping us follow Jesus closer. So to me, the role of the church, anytime we gather together, is what kind of spark can we give and what kind of resources can we supply our congregation, whether it's theological teaching, whether it's teaching them the role of, worship and gathering together and worshiping God and glorifying God. All those things are necessary. But if it stops at doing the act itself and doesn't propel us as a catalyst into actually following Jesus in a much closer way, then we're completely missing the mark. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I would say so, right? Like, I think it's, the corporate church is a great place to encounter the living God, and everything that we do should push us towards that. And I think disciple making is like, okay, you just had an experience with the living God. Now what? Like, now what do we do with that? How do we hold that? How do we, and the truth is that for a long time, we just haven't done a great job of explaining that. We have these emotional experiences, or people get baptized, and then, okay, well, now you're in the club. Great. And so in the Wesleyan tradition, the tradition I grew up in, we would say it's now we have to pursue sanctification, right? Which I know that you went to a Nazarene college, I think. And so like that whole process of like
I was a heathen. I
entire
went to all
sanctification.
secular schools, but came from a Wesleyan background for sure.
Yeah. So like that whole idea about like sanctification or pursuing the process of becoming more like Christ, I think that happens in disciple making after we have this encounter with the risen Lord. Okay, now what do we do about it, and how do we shift it, and how do we change it?
Yeah. And a piece that as I talk to you and as I've gotten to know you over the last year or so, one thing that I really appreciate coming from your perspective is when you talk about, I don't remember how you word it. It's like, tithing your time to be able to create disciple making relationships. So talk a little bit about that, because that's something you do very actively every single week. The one thing I really appreciate about you is, you're not in the office a ton. And I say that as the greatest of compliments, because, you're out meeting with people, you're working through those intentional disciple making relationships. And I think that is time incredibly well spent that I wish more church leaders would do. And I'm even trying to do more consistently, trying to pull myself out of what are the tasks that need done to make weekends happen versus how can I be pouring into people, which is that really deep work. So like, what does that look like for you? Just tell me a little bit about how you kind of go about your week.
Well, I would say this. I challenge myself, and I challenge anyone who works on a church staff team. So if you're listening to this and you're a vocational staff member, I would challenge you to tithe your week in disciple making relationships. So for me, that looks at like a minimum of 4 hours a week of intentionally pouring in to humans, right? Specifically dudes, because I just tend to lean more towards same gender disciple making relationships. But so there are at least 4 guys a week that I work with and help them follow Jesus and give them tools that they can give away to help the next person follow Jesus. So if you and I were discipling, and we, maybe we get to know each other at the church, I'd invite you to coffee. We say we have some coffee and then we like it. So maybe next time we do lunch. By the second or third meeting, what I'm doing is I'm assessing if you're faithful, available, teachable, or what we call FAT. Faithful, available, teachable. Are you committed to the Lord? Do you have space in your life? Do you have a humble enough posture to receive instruction? If the answer is yes to all 3, then what I would do is I would say, Dusty, I've really enjoyed our time together. And one of the things that the Lord has called me to do is to make disciples who can make disciples. And so I'm wondering if you would prayerfully discern about getting into a disciple-making relationship. And what that looks like is you and I would meet regularly. I would give you homework, and we would push each other towards following Jesus more closely. And now here's the only caveat before you say yes, is that the one thing that we have to agree on is that when we both say that you're ready, you'll go and do the same with someone else. Meaning that everything I give you, you have to promise that you'll give away to the next generation of spiritual descendants.
Yeah, that's really good, man, because multiplication is the key, right? I was just reading through the first couple chapters of Acts, getting ready for our what we call our Discover Grace class for new folks, folks that are newer into the church, and just talking about the ways that the early church really had this right. The early church was all about not just a much more what we'd call trendy, organic experience, right? They were living together, they were literally sharing their lives together, as opposed to just kind of coming to a church building once a week. But it was all about multiplication, right? And I think when we talk about, churches in terms of life groups, which, most churches I'd say do, where those tend to fall short is when you want them to multiply, right? That's always the tension to manage is like, I found this great group of people that I really love. And once I found out that I really love spending time with them, I don't want to leave them. And therefore it kind of just dies on the vine right there with that group. And I think with disciple making, there's this amazing ability to say, hey, I can be discipled by somebody, but I'm going to find a couple other people that I can do the same thing with. And then we actually do create something the church always says it wants to do, but never knows how to do, which is generational disciple making. It's how does one generation affect the next?
And one of the things that I think is important, and how I often have to talk about it, because it becomes very eh, kind of muddied for a lot of Christians, is that I have different groups of friends. So like I have compartmentalized relationships for specific intention. And that sounds weird, but really what it is, it's purposeful, right? And so I've got a group of guys that I disciple and I pour into, and I expect them to do the same thing. Then I have a group of friends, right? And those friends I'm not discipling intentionally. I'm just with them, right? Like, and we hang out and whatever, and we work together in this case. Like those kind of friends, my friend group. And then I have another group, which are my non-Christian friends. And those are people that I eventually want to move down the path in every area. So I've got non-Christian friends. I got my normal, just hang out Christian friends. And then I got the guys who I would call my spiritual sons in the faith, like Paul talked about Timothy with. These are the guys who I'm intentionally pouring into, and we're in it, and whether or not we're in it for a year or 2 years or 3 years, or maybe they don't last at all and they're only there for a couple of months. Well, then, those are all different situations, but you can kind of see that compartmentalization says, okay, well, as a pastor, I do pastoral counseling. That doesn't count as my disciple making time. I hang out with friends. That doesn't count as my disciple making time. Like the only reason it makes it disciple making time is the intentionality that I bring to the meeting that makes it reproducible. I'm relational everywhere because I tend to just be relational, but I'm intentional there because I want it to be reproducible.
Yeah, and that's a place that I think a lot of church leaders, at least that I've known in my circles, have probably really struggled with, is not lumping everything ministry wise into, oh, it's all discipleship because it's all worship, because it's all, just like you said, go back to the Robert Coleman book. You can write this book on what really is discipleship, but they don't realize it because we lump everything together under one
Right.
term, and we lack that intentionality of this is kind of a specific part of what God's calling us to do. When we think about the Great Commission, go and what, right? To go and make disciples. Obviously, that. But I think most churches maybe mistakenly assume, and maybe most churches isn't fair. Just a lot of churches I've been a part of or been around have mistakenly assumed that just because we do the ministry thing, we are going to automatically make disciples as a byproduct.
Well, and so somewhere along the way, and I would push on this idea of North American consumerism as kind of a catalyst towards it. Somewhere along the way, we thought that disciple making was a program of the church. Oh, the church has to make disciples. But that's not what we see biblically. We see individuals make disciples because it's relational, right? So there is no like relational kind of intimacy with the institution that is the church. And so I'm always telling leaders, like, you should make disciples because you're a Christian, right? You should make at least one because you're a Christian. You should tithe your week because you're in vocational ministry, right? So I tithe my week in disciple making relationships because I have the ability to do so because of my job. But if I worked 9 to 5 at Kroger's, I would still want to make disciples because that's what Christ compels me to do, right? We live out the great commandment by fulfilling the great commission. And so the best way to love our neighbors is to go in and make disciples. And I'm so passionate about this in the sense of like, I actually believe that this is how we'll change the world. Is that if every Christian just went and picked up one person of the same gender from the ages of 16 to 25 or 13 to 30, imagine what would happen to school shootings. Imagine what would happen to the culture. Right? People get so mad at Doja Cat, right? Like in the satanic stuff and all this jazz. But if you really want to fix this, go disciple someone, right? Like get so close to them that you can hear their thoughts and their heart, and you can share yours. That transform people, right? That's transformational ministry. I'm preaching. I'm sorry.
No, it's good, man. That's why I brought you on here to do. Like, the only people I want to talk to are people that are passionate about what they believe. And I think that's worth having a passion over. Because, it's funny you talked about compartmentalization, because one of the mistakes that I think that, let's just put ourselves in the church going category, that Western Christians tend to make is we compartmentalize church into just a weekend experience, right? We say, hey, as long as I check that box and I attend the thing, the the structure, the building,
Yeah.
whatever, then that's my Christianity that I've done compartmentalized. Now I can go back to living my life the way I want to live my life. And once again, going back to this vision of the church in Acts, there was not a compartmentalization of how we lived out our faith. It was a part of us. It was a part of everyday living. And there was no distinction between, oh, this is my work self. This is my home self. This is my church self, where I come and teach Sunday school on the weekends. And I think we need to, if we got back to really living out our Christianity, I think it would look much more like what you're talking about. And we'd rely a whole lot less on something that the gathered church was never really meant to do in the first place.
Well, and so one of the things that I appreciate about your ministry at Kingdom Calibrate is that emphasis on the kingdom. And so when I'm discipling guys, one of the things I tell them is I don't actually care where someone goes to church in order to disciple them. If the Lord puts someone in front of me and I get the kind of that nudge from the Spirit to disciple them, I never make them go to my church. Now, if they want to come, great. I think we have a great thing going. I'm really excited about our movement, but our movement has some identity pieces that may not fit everyone, right? And that's not a requirement. That's not a requirement for me to make disciples, because I'm trying to build the kingdom of God, not the castle of Centerville Grace, even though I love our castle, right? Like, and so kingdom building means I'll disciple you regardless of what your faith is, right? If you're a Methodist or Brethren or Catholic, like, I just want to help you follow Jesus. Theology, doctrine, polity, liturgy, those are all disciple tools. And the most effective discipleship tool is the one that someone will use. So if you feel more comfortable going to Sunday mass and sit still, kneel, sit, stand, kneel, repeat, then do that. But let's talk about why it matters. Let's talk about what the value is. Let's talk about why it's personal and Jesus wants to transform our hearts.
Man, that's good. I love that. And yeah, that's the heart of, like you said, Kingdom Calibrate. And I know that's your heart, and what you do is, I want to live truthful to that great priestly prayer that Jesus prayed, which is that we may all be one, right? And, as much as I like to joke about it, I don't think any of us are going to get asked at the pearly gates, hey, which church were you a part of? And that's something I have seen, maybe to a dangerous degree, is, hey, if I'm part of something that feels exciting, then I can offload my own responsibility as a Christian onto the church that I go to, because I become just associated with the thing. And as long as the thing is doing really good work, that takes the pressure off me, and I don't have to do much in the process. I just have to say I'm a part of the thing. Right. And that gets us into the really dangerous territory where we don't have any responsibility for our own spiritual formation and how we're pouring into others.
Yeah. And so I would also say that in the church staff world, that far too often we take our job and we say that that's kind of our identity, but making disciples isn't a spiritual gift. It's a commandment, right? Like, it's not one of those things that you can opt out of. And so I would say that you're a mature Christ follower when you've made a disciple who's made a disciple. And I've got spiritual grandchildren. I love the way Paul talks to Timothy in 1st and 2nd Timothy. He says, my spiritual son in the faith. Well, one day I can't wait to get to heaven, and I can't wait to see what God did through all the people that I got to disciple. Right. And I'm crystal clear that God's the catalyst, but I have this vision that one day in heaven, I'm going to see my spiritual descendants, and they will live into that promise that God made to Abram, which is that they will outnumber the stars. And I just did one part of that. Like, I'm just a piece of the domino rally, so to speak, of spiritual descendants that God worked through the people in the time that I got to be alive. And that fires me up.
Yeah, man. And that's a beautiful thought, right? Is that we get to play a role in what God's doing, like, not because he needs us, right? But because he chooses to let us live into that. And I think we are the most fulfilled if we understand that vision that God's got for our lives, which is, not just, it goes to like my escapism roots of growing up, like very, very fundamental kind of Baptist of like, hey, the goal is just to get out of here, right? The goal is to escape this awful, awful place that gets worse every single day, right? And we don't have control politics, and they kicked God out of the schools, and go on and on and on. And to me, it's I just, not that I don't care about all that, but I think we've got a purpose for being here, right? The Christian church always had a purpose in the world. It wasn't meant to just get away out of the world and escape it. And what you're talking about is exactly that. It's like, man, no matter how bad things get, we have a purpose to be relational and intentionally relational for the purpose of multiplying disciples, where we can share with others and help them grow in their faith and just show them how God is working in their lives. And like, what better thing is there than that?
Well, and this is what I always say is like, hey, you don't have to make disciples. God loves us so much that he doesn't say we have, like we're not robots. We get to choose. But here's the thing. When you don't make disciples, you're leaving the fullness of life with Christ on the table. And so the fullness of life with Christ is the fruit of the Spirit, right? It's hope, love, joy, peace, faith, all the other ones I can't remember, but like, it's all of those things. And that happens when we live into the fullness of life. Well, that fullness of life comes when we're giving him away out of our overflow, out of our abundance, out of our relationship. And so we're designed to be in relationship. The Trinity is relational, right? The character of God is relational. And I'm here for all that.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this last question then. What are some ways that you think the church can move forward in our understanding of what it is to make disciples? How can the church be a resource in an effective way to making sure that we can, resource our people to do exactly that?
I think that if church leadership, lay or vocational, right? If church leadership would make a commitment to making disciples, it would not take long in church years to start to see a wave that's different. If we stopped setting the goal, getting people to come to church, and we started setting the goal and just routinely talking about it, and I see some churches doing this well, right? If we set the goal to make disciples who can make disciples everywhere, every week, everything we talked about, it would begin to change things. And we would hand the faith down. And it happens already on accident because that's how good God is. Like it happens, from one generation to the next because of the saints that have lived the faith. But I just want to, I want to encourage church leaders to just think about what you're setting as the goal, because what gets rewarded gets repeated. And if the goal is multiplication, then we will stop caring about attendance and the church will always be full.
Yeah. That's really good, man. I love that. And it's deep. And, it lets us pursue the right things, and like in the stat world, obviously we talk about lead and lag indicators, and we're always trying to figure out in churches, hey, what's a lead indicator? And I think what you're saying, and I think I agree with that, is if we were making disciples as our lead, then the lag indicator would be attendance, whereas often we make the attendance our lead indicator, and then the discipling becomes the lag indicator.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And honestly, just if you had a church full of disciples, attendance would look different. The average monthly attendance of 1.6 would get blown out of the water because disciples go to worship not because they feel guilted into it or forced or coerced or social pressure. They go because of the relationship that they have with the Lord. Right. And so I know I've seen that in you and Nicole. Like you guys have this relationship with God that propels you to worship. It doesn't force you. Like it's just out of the overflow. And so it's just like me going to my kids' games. I don't go to my games because I always love it. Right? Like sixth grade cheerleading is not always what I love. Praise the Lord. But I love them. And so I go out of my love for them and I'm happy to be there. And sometimes I'm enthusiastic about it.
Yeah.
I never leave. Like I never leave church or cheerleading going, man, that was a horrible decision, because I'm there out of love. And that's what I pray for the church.
Yeah. And not to make light of it, but it could be way worse, man. Have you ever been to a swim meet?
Oh, woo, come on.
Oh,
that's a whole different podcast.
Yeah, I know, right? The hardest sports to just sit through, man. And
wrestling, that's another one.
That
list could go on.
Yeah, it could. And I don't want to get myself in any more trouble with shots fired because my kids are not old enough to be involved in much of anything that requires us to be a part of the team yet. The one's independent, man. I don't know. I got to teach him how to be a team player. The other one, he's a little bit of a bruiser, so he's gonna be a football guy.
That's awesome.
Oh man. Well, hey, dude, this has been an awesome conversation. I appreciate you jumping on here with me. I just want to end it with this. Can you point any church leaders listening to this to some resources, maybe some things to better understand, since we just talked about a surface level of what disciple making could look like in the church. What are some resources they could go to, and how can you help them get a little further in this conversation?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, anybody can email me, tony@centervillegrace.org. I'm happy to help field some questions. My dear friend Justin Gravitt and I have been on a mission to help resource church leaders for a long time. So we're in season 4 of a podcast called the Practitioners Podcast, and it's all about Jesus-style disciple making in everyday life. And it really is kind of 4 different seasons. We're in the middle of the 4th season right now on what it means to make very specifically intentional, relational, reproducible tools for disciple making. So it's a toolbox that you can pull out of if you've got questions about how to start, how to stop, what to do if you're an extrovert, what to do if you're an introvert, and all the different things. It's very detailed. It's very niche, or however people like to say it. Niche. I don't know. Whatever. You get it. So that's a great place. I also recommend Navigators Church Ministries.org. They are great for tools, and that's where I find a lot of my tools at. And then, people can always find me at twmilt.com if they want to look at some of my other podcasts that I do, some leadership and Reclaiming the Faith podcasts. It's all there for your disposal. Just if you Google Tony Miltenberger, something around disciple making is likely to come up. The same with Justin Gravitt.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that, man. And thanks for giving us a lot to think through in terms of how we view the church's role when it comes to disciple making. Even more important, how we view our own role when it comes to disciple making, which is the deep piece. Yeah. So, Tony, thanks again, man. Appreciate you jumping on here.
Appreciate you, brother. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we've got a lot to think about, right? When you're thinking of your churches, thinking about how to implement what we talked about today, how can I become a more intentional disciple maker instead of just running through the programs that we offer as a church? Man, I encourage you, reach out to Tony. That's something that is really worth considering. And just as he said, man, that is what it looks like to help fulfill the Great Commission that God allows us to participate within. So thank you for joining us on episode 105 of the Kingdom Calibrate podcast. Be sure to check us out every Tuesday. We're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and we drop new episodes every Tuesday morning. So we'll see you next time.